A lot of people think there's going to be this magical day where they've got no job, no kids, no responsibilities, no business. And that's when they're going to write their book. And that's just never going to happen. Like, you're going to have to get started before you're ready. There's never a good time to write a book. I view it as a short-term sacrifice and a short-term investment to build a long-term asset.
Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. On the show, I interview peak performing innovators in the creative, social impact, and earth conservation spaces. I also bring you ideas and techniques that you can grab and use to set goals, create, and unlock your potential for changing yourself and the world. And now let's get to the show. Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. You're going to love this guest. I'm just telling you now. Check out Chandler Bolt. Chandler Bolt is an investor, the CEO of Self-Publishing School and selfpublishing.com. He's Forbes 30 Under 30 and the author of 7 best-selling books, including his most recent book that's titled Published. Obviously, you know what we're going to be talking about. Self-Publishing School is an Inc. 5000 company for the last 3 years in a row as one of the 5,000 fastest growing private companies in the USA. Chandler is also the host of the 7-Figure Principles podcast and the Self-Publishing School podcast. Through his books, podcasts, YouTube channels, and self-publishing schools, he has helped thousands of people write a book that grows their income, impact business. And quite frankly, if you're in the fiction realm, this might be very interesting to you too, because self-publishing nowadays is queen. Chandler, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Yes, ma'am. Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here, in part because I am an author myself. So I am thrilled to talk to you about the help that you're giving so many people who have their story to tell, whether it's for their business or maybe even just to have their story out in the world. I would love it if you talk a little bit about what brought you from where you were to where you are. How did you get to this place where, you know what I want to do? I want to help people self-publish their books.
Yeah. I think books were a big part of it. I mean, ironically enough, I'm a C-level English student and a college dropout with ADHD. So kind of the last person you'd ever think to write a book or to write books. I mean, I dropped out of school and because I was tired of learning how to run a business from professors who have never ran businesses. What I've always wanted to do is run businesses. But I didn't particularly love reading or writing. And so I just kind of avoided it. But then when I dropped out of school, I said, well, I need to keep learning as if I'm in school, but just change the mechanism and how I'm learning. And so I really turned to books, and I wrote and published my first couple books, and then also kind of simultaneously started reading like crazy. And it just opened up this whole world. And so I think in that I discovered that books change lives. Books change the lives of readers. I mean, I think that's kind of obvious. And so many people listening to this can probably name at least one book that's changed their life. But then also books started changing my life as an author. And so did it a couple of times. People started asking about it. And then finally said, maybe I should start teaching this because just so many people were asking. And then we started teaching it at Self-Publishing School. Or we started teaching it in what ultimately became Self-Publishing School. And then fast forward today, and we've published about 6,000 books over the last 7 years, so about 2 to 3 books a day.
Unbelievable. That's amazing. Congratulations on the success. And also, no, seriously, because this is one of those things, there are a lot of people out there who are afraid, right? They might have a story to tell. They might have something that would be really helpful to people, but they are afraid to publish their books, in part because there are so many, but also because to make a book successful, like you invest your money, you invest your time, you invest your soul, maybe, and make a deal with the devil, whatever, to write this book, and then you might sell 50 copies. So I'd love to find out from you you've published over 6,000 books, who should be writing books? What are the reasons someone might write a book? And what is your advice for people who want to get started?
Yeah, I think who should be writing books? I mean, I think people who want to grow their impact, their income, or their business. Those are kind of the 3 groups of people. So we've got probably people, people who want to grow their business using a book. That's a big amount of people that come to us. A big group of people that come to work with us are people who say, hey, I've got this book that I've got to write. And either it's going to be a part of my legacy or it's going to be a part of the impact that I want to make. And they do that. I mean, sometimes that's fiction. It's like, hey, I've got this story that is just burning a hole in my brain and I got to share it. So I think those are probably the 2 or 3 buckets of people who come to us for help on their books. And then who should write a book? I mean, I used to get asked this question all the time, and I guess still do somewhat, but should everyone write a book? And I used to say no. and there's just some people that just should not write a book. But then I really had a friend challenge me on that. And he said, do you ever wish that you could read the book of your grandfather? Or your grandpa, your grandma, whoever. And the answer was yes, because I had a grandpa that passed away when I was 1 year old. And by all accounts, he was a legend.
Wow.
But I will never know what his life was like, the lessons that he learned, all those things. So that coming down to that, I think for most, even if it's just for that reason of just for my kids and grandkids, I think everyone has a story to share and lessons that they can share. And sure, it might not be a New York Times bestseller, but it can be meaningful, at least to you and a small group of people around you. And so I think that's who should write it. And then I think the bigger question that you asked is how do you do it? Or how do you get started? And for me, I think anyone listening to this, if you got a topic that you think you want to write about, as soon as you get done listening to this podcast interview, grab a blank sheet of paper. So I teach this process. It's called the MORE writing method. MORE is an acronym, and the M stands for mind map, right? And so I would take 15 minutes, mind map out everything that you can think of on that topic. So stories that you have, lessons that you've learned, everything you can think of. Right. And then in doing that, I think you're going to discover that you've got a whole lot more that you can write about than you think. And that's going to help you get started on the journey to writing your book and make the writing process a whole lot easier.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. It's funny when I do that, I give myself 5 minutes and I go 30, I want to come up with 30 whatevers, 30 headlines, 30 topics, 30 ideas, and just really push myself. And yet, frankly, I have so many ideas that I will never write all of them, right? I will never write all the books. So how do you, as someone who's teaching people how to do this, how do you teach people to hone in on their message or hone in on their story? Because sometimes we meander. I know I do. My husband and I call it shiny pretty thing syndrome. He's got ADHD and he's easily distracted away from whatever it was he was trying to do. And the same thing can happen in stories, whether it's a nonfiction tale or a fictional one. You can run away from your point pretty far and then not get back to it. And then you sort of look at this project and go, well, what was I trying to do? What is your guidance for someone who needs that sort of structure?
Yeah, I recommend, I think this is where it dovetails back because I can relate to that because that's me, right? I have and continue to struggle with a lot of the things that you just mentioned. And so I think that's where it dovetails back with that MORE writing method. And so it's an acronym. I talk about it in my new book. And so the M is mind map, as we already covered, but then the O stands for outline. And so using that mind map to inform an outline. And I think sometimes for people like you or your husband or myself, that can sound constricting. It's like, oh, that sucks. And I create this outline. It's just rigid. Where's the creativity in that? But really it introduces freedom. And so because you have kind of some guardrails, you can then be expressive and know that you're not losing the plot of the book. And so that mind map, then turn that mind map into an outline. The R stands for rough draft. The E stands for editing, right? So mind map, outline, rough draft, editing. And an important piece there is as you're writing your rough draft, go one chapter at a time and mind map, outline, then write that chapter, right? And repeat that process chapter by chapter by chapter. And I think that's how you stay on track on a per chapter basis and within the overarching outline for the book as a whole, while still making consistent progress and feeling good about the process and not feeling like you're restricted to this outline. Because that's the big thing is an outline is very helpful, but it's also fluid. And so I think sometimes people will create, especially type A personalities will create this outline. It's like, oh, now I got to stick to the
Right.
outline, can't change it. And so then of course they feel intimidated by creating this outline, right? Because they think it's going to be this immovable thing that they'll never be able to change. So either they don't create the outline, or they spend so long creating that outline that they don't actually start writing the book. And so that's why I just encourage that kind of iterative process. And then great news, you'll get the rough draft finished if you follow that process. And then that's where the editing comes in to make it a much better book.
I love it. I love it. You're going to hear silence on my end periodically, Chandler. I just want to tell you that. And that's because I sort of want to take in what you've said and process it and synthesize it before I come up with my next question. And I love the notion that you said, that it's guardrails. And I talk about guardrails with my clients too, that, guardrails, like when you're going bowling and you're a kid, they put those little rails up that no matter where you throw the ball, generally speaking, it's going in the right direction. So it's sort of a constraint, if you will, that you can work within. And yet when you're doing it, when you're sitting down to write, like you said, you might go, oh, this is intimidating to me, but you still have to put your butt in your seat and you still have to get the writing down. So what is your thought about the psychology of getting used to the fact that you're a writer? Right? People want to write a book, but they think, oh, but I'm not a writer. What is your thought about that? Like, put your butt in your seat and write 500 words is one thing, but how do we get around or work through the intimidation and the lack of confidence about telling our story?
Yeah. I was in Scouts growing up, and the Boy Scouts, and my Scoutmaster, we were on this camping trip in the mountains. I'm from South Carolina, and it's kind of the Blue Ridge Mountains there. And we were in the mountains on a camping trip. And I remember asking, I said, hey, are there bears in these woods? I'd heard that there were bears. and he said, yep, there are. Like, that's why we hang up, that's why we hang up our food in the tree, is so that the bears don't, break into our stuff and eat our food and all that stuff. And I said, well, hold up. What happens if we see a bear while we're in the woods? And he kind of made a joke and gave me a wink and said, if we run into a bear, here's the good news. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than your friend.
Oh my goodness.
and
Yikes.
And it's just like, well, hold up. What does this have to do with writing a book? And I think for a lot of people, when they go to write a book, there's this imposter syndrome that comes up, right? Which is, who am I to write a book? Who's going to listen to me? Is this book going to be any good? And the bad news is that never really ever goes away. But the good news is that you don't have to be faster than the bear, or you don't have to know everything, right? You just have to know a little bit more than the person that you're teaching. Right. So you don't have to know everything. You just have to know a little bit more than the person that you're teaching. And so that would be my encouragement for people who are maybe in that phase, thinking about not starting or afraid to start. Right. And so that's the mindset piece. And then there's the discipline piece, which we already mentioned, which is you've got to get your mind map and outline done in your first 1,000 words on the page. And my goal is for people to get there as fast as possible after listening to this interview, because once you get to that point, you're going to start to believe that this is possible. And then it's about bridging from your first 1,000 words to your rough draft done. And when you get your rough draft done, that's when, light bulbs just go on. You start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. You start to believe that this is possible. This is not just an idea. This is actually happening. Like, there's all those things. And so that's the goal, is to get to that point sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I feel like I should be going mic drop after every time you finish speaking. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, though, that I work with a lot of clients who want to write stories, who want to have their say, who want to start a podcast, whatever it is. There is that barrier of entry that they feel like they can't. They're too busy. They've got, I've got children. I've got this. I've got that. How do I find the time? How do I do it in a way not only that gets over that imposter syndrome that you're talking about, but also how do I eke out the time in my busy day if I'm a business owner, or if I have, or if writing is my side hustle, for example? How do I do that? What's your thought on what do we need to do? Like what I tell my clients is you don't have to write for an hour a day. You can write for 5 minutes a day as long as you make it a habit, right? But there might be a better way. So I'd love to know from you, what is the method that you encourage your students and your clients to use to actually make time to write their story?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things that I would mention. One is, I think you're exactly right. A lot of people think there's going to be this magical day where they've got no job, no kids, no responsibilities, no business, and that's when they're going to write their book. And that's just never going to happen. Like, you're going to have to get started before you're ready. There's never a good time to write a book. You're going to have to start before you're ready. And I view it as a short-term sacrifice and a short-term investment to build a long-term asset, right? You sacrifice that time, whether it's over the course of a year, 2 years, whatever it is, you're doing that sacrifice, and that book is going to go on to impact thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of people. All these benefits are going to come from that, right? But it takes that short-term sacrifice. Now, once you commit to doing that, I think you need a strong why and a strong why now to even get started in the process. But then there's the practicality of, okay, how do you roll up your sleeves and actually get it done? So I say play to your strengths and how you write best. So are you someone who's, okay, you need to batch a weekend and say, I'm going to make as much progress as possible in a short weekend? Or are you someone who says, hey, I'm pretty disciplined and I can do 30 minutes a day, or I can do 1,000 words a day? Well, if you do 1,000 words a day for 60 days straight, that's 60,000 words. That's a nonfiction book. You can go even shorter than that on nonfiction books, but that's definitely a full-length nonfiction book, right? So that's what I would recommend for folks. Follow the Moore writing method: mind map, outline, rough draft, and editing. Do it one chapter at a time. And if you're really ambitious, you can go to page 67 in my new book. I talk about this 30-day rough draft challenge. And it's kind of it's a challenge.
For sure.
It's called a challenge. But it can help for folks who say, hey, I want to dive in and make as much progress as possible over the course of 30 days and maybe even finish a draft in 30 days.
Wow. You know what? This is a really good time to talk about. Is this the newest book published, or is there a different book? Yeah. Can you tell me?
Yeah, this is
tell me a little bit about that, because you mentioned it a little and I sort of did a little research on Amazon, but I'd love it if you would talk a little bit about what it is that you're teaching in the book that you haven't taught before, especially.
Yeah. So the book is called Published: The Proven Path from Blank Page to 10,000 Copies Sold. And it's a second edition. So the first edition has been downloaded and sold hundreds of thousands of times. But kind of like we talked about at the top of this interview, we've published 6,000 books over the last few years, and we've learned so much, and our curriculum's gotten so much better, but the book stayed the same. Mm-hmm. And I read it back and I said, you know what, this kind of sucks. It needs to be a lot better. and so I made it way better. And so the goal is to guide people from idea, or maybe even not quite sure on your idea yet, to 10,000 copies sold. And so that's the goal of the book. And that's what I try to do by walking people through each step in the process. And so, I mentioned this to you before, but I'm happy to mention it here. But I created a link for folks if they want to grab a copy. Obviously, you can get it on Amazon, or you can listen to the Audible version. I narrate the audiobook. It's kind of fun. But I created a link. It's publishedbook.com. So like I published a book. So publishedbook.com/Izolda.
Yep, that's it.
So
Izolda. That's me.
Yeah. I was just about to spell it out. But first 50 people who go to that page, I want to give you a free physical copy of the book. And so this is, no strings attached. You don't have to pay anything. Just tell me where to send it. I'll print it, pack it, ship it. Just as a thank you for listening to this episode. And as a thank you to Izolda for having me come on the podcast.
That is, Chandler, thank you so much. That's lovely and generous, and I appreciate it very much. And so do my listeners, I'm sure. The thing that you said about it is that that I went, yeah, so true. You went back and you reread it and you went, oh no, I can do so much better, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about going back? You said earlier it's an iterative process to write a book, but also going back and looking at your early work, you kind of go, oh wait, I can do better now. I know more. I can write better. All of these things. Can you talk a little bit about that process? How did you come to terms with it, and what did you improve?
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about self-publishing, is that you can go back and make any changes, updates, or edits at any time. Right. So I didn't have to get approval from a publisher. I didn't have to get a second publishing deal. Any of those things make the process longer than it needed to be. I'll tell you what I did, and it's actually kind of funny. I read the book. Shocker. But I marked it up. I mean, I'm talking all kinds of notes, things I wanted to improve, all that. And you probably know this as an author yourself, but I've got all kinds of copies of my book around the house that I just give to people when they come over to the house, or when I, go to a meeting or something. And I went to move, and I marked it up, and I said, all right, I'm going to do this. And then, much like a lot of people, our students or people before they come to work with us, I just put it off. And I'm like, all right, don't have time. All the same excuses that we hear all the time. And finally I was moving, and I was like, all right, well, I know I still want to do this. Where's that copy that I marked up? And I couldn't find it anywhere. And what I realized is that I had given it away.
Oh no!
To some unsuspecting soul that has probably never read the book, because no one ever reached out to me to tell me. And so I was like, oh, dang it. And so I had to go back and read it again. But it's kind of helpful, because then I read it again. I marked it up, and I said, all right, I need to do this, and I need to show people that this process is possible at the highest level. So while running a big company with 30 something employees and all that stuff, I said, hey, I'm going to set aside the time to do this. And I looked at all the content and curriculum. I said, what do we know now that we didn't know then? And what is our current best thinking and current best teaching? And then I just followed the process that I teach in the book. So I mind mapped all that stuff. I outlined all that stuff, and ended up with probably, I'd estimate somewhere around 60 to 80% new content for the second edition, and then use that, and went from, picking up a pen on, I want to say it was September 1st, to publishing the second edition on December 14th. So all told, about 105 days. I used the process that we teach, and I did.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I love that putting the punctuation point on it is I started it and I went through the process and then I finished it. And finishing is hard for people, right? That's especially for people who have a lot of things to focus on. Finishing, actually going, you know what, it's done, is difficult. So how do you know when it's done?
You don't. You just have to decide. A book is never done. You could edit a book into eternity, but at some point you just have to say, stop the madness. This is done, and I'm going to put it out.
Right.
I know it's not like this precise, technical, exact answer that I think a lot of people are looking for in that moment. It's just, but I think even some of that is you're just looking for someone to tell you that it's done. If you don't know, and no one's going to tell you that it's done, and you're not going to definitively know. You just have to say, hey, this is good enough.
Right.
And great news, if I'm self-publishing, I can always go back and update it later. So let me publish this, let me get feedback, and then I can go do updates later if needed.
Yeah, I love that. I love the notion of having your audience, your readers actually give you feedback. And what I tell my clients and the people I work with is put it aside and try to read it as if you weren't the one who wrote it. Because that's really helpful. It's helpful, because if I look at something I've written as if I wrote it, then all I see is the mistakes. If I look at it as someone who didn't write it, then I get to be more in the flow of whatever my thesis is, in the flow of whatever I'm trying to say with the book. And so by the time it gets to an audience, of course, I think it's as good as I can make it, like programming, right? A coder doesn't give it to the QA/QC person thinking, oh, it's full of bugs, it's full of mistakes. You think you're as done as you could be. So let me ask you something about audience, right? About the people you intend to read the book. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, about how you choose your audience, how you write to your audience, or maybe you don't. Maybe you write the story you want to write and hope you find your audience. But I have a feeling you've got a process for that. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think about this. I call this the 4 Ps of a best-selling book. And I think about it this way. So the 4 Ps, they stand for person, pain, promise, price. Mm-hmm. Right now, the price part, that's pretty self-explanatory depending on what format you're using or what genre you're in. But the other 3 are really important. And so person, this is the person that you're writing to. Right, I'm going to come back to that. The pain, this is the pain that they have that they know that they have. Right, so this is how they would state the pain that they have. And then the promise is what's the promise or outcome that they want or hope to have, or that you hope to give them by them reading your book. Mm-hmm. Right now, I think the most important part of that is exactly what you said, is your audience, and that's the person. Now, what I recommend here is coming up with one actual person in your life that you know, that you write the book to. That is your ideal reader, is what I call it. And so your ideal reader, let's say it's you, Izolda, and so I want to come up with that one person. Okay, I know this person. Now I write the book to that person. So all the other questions that people have about writing, of, okay, how do you write to, how should I write this? What should my voice be? Should I be funny? Should I be serious? Should I include this story? Should I not? All those questions get answered so easily, because it's just, oh, well, how would I write this to Izolda? Would I use this story? Would I not? Would I be serious, or would I be funny? All those questions get answered. And you write to that one person. Some people will even go as far as saying, "Dear Izolda," right? Like writing it as if it's a letter. Right. And then you can just delete that part after the fact. But that can work really well. But that's what I recommend, to write a better book and write it to a specific person. Because then guess what? When you go market that book, you know where that person's hanging out, which makes the marketing process easier. And there's going to be a whole lot of other people just like that person that say, oh my gosh, Chandler wrote this book directly to me. And it's going to feel like it because you wrote it specifically to one person.
I love that. And it is interesting to me that in that moment when you're writing it and you're thinking, okay, I have something to say and I have something to teach, that's a different part of the process. Or maybe it's not. Maybe you have a tie into this. But actually getting the book out there, right? The publishing it, the physical part of getting it published, getting it out into the world. But also, to me, what is one of the most challenging thing is how to launch it so that it isn't, a drop in the bucket, so that it actually works, so that it actually goes where you want it to go, succeeds, if you will. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about both, and we can break this up into several questions. But first, the actual physical publishing process, whether it's going to be an ebook or paperback or hardcover or whatever, but also how do you launch a book so that it actually launches instead of fizzling?
Yeah. It's a very nuanced subject, and we could do multiple podcast interviews just on this piece.
You're welcome back anytime.
I'd love to. So let me break it up in this way. So we already talked about one of the fundamental pieces of marketing, which is those 4 Ps, which a lot of people would think that that's not marketing, but it 100% is, because you're writing a better book to a specific audience, which writing a better book means it's more recommendable and more people are going to read it. And then to a specific audience means it's going to be easier to market. And so that's a big piece. Then you've got what I would call the fundamentals of a bestseller. This is, okay, are you writing a well-written, timeless book? Are you solving a pain that people have, that they know that they have, that they're eagerly looking to solve? Do you have a good title, a good subtitle, a good cover? Have you picked keywords and categories properly, like all these kind of nuanced, technical, specific stuff with Amazon? Have you published all 3 formats of your book? Publish 3 formats, you're going to sell more books, you're going to make more money on royalties, right? And have you got at least 100 reviews on Amazon? And so I know I rattled off a bunch of things there. I've got a whole checklist in the chapter in the new book on the fundamentals of the bestseller, but that's the fundamentals, right? Then there's the actual launch itself. And then there's kind of the final phase, which is what I call the 1-year launch. I think a lot of people look at their launch as a launch week. And I think it's actually a launch year. Your launch week is the starting point. And you should continue to talk about it and market your book for at least a year after you publish it. So I think that's really important. But then I'll zoom in on the launch week itself. And so there's what I call this is the launch triangle. And so it's the 3 essentials to a successful launch. It's number 1, a launch team, which I'll circle back to. Number 2, it's getting as many reviews as possible. And then number 3, it's promotions. Now, running promotions, there's a bunch of options and all that, but that's kind of it's like an accordion, like depending on how much time, money, and energy you have to spend on this launch, that will either be what I call the MVP launch, so the minimum viable product, right? Or it'll be the traditional launch, which is kind of everything and a big launch and all that stuff. And so that the promotions piece is the accordion, but I said I'll circle back to the launch team. So launch team, this is a small group of people, 15, 50 people, maybe more, who support you or the topic of the book, right? Now, what I recommend is recruit your launch team, and they will read the book ahead of time and leave a review on day 1. So now all of a sudden you've got supporters and all of these folks leaving reviews right out of the gates, which is going to help you have a more successful launch of the book.
I'm thinking. I just realized I'm staying quiet. I think that's a great idea. And where do you go to recruit these people? Are these friends? Are these people you find in Facebook groups? How do you find your launch team?
Yeah, great question. I think it's friends, family members, customers, colleagues, anyone who supports you or the topic of your book. And what I like to do is share the process. So share what I'm doing as I'm doing it leading up to the launch, which just naturally people are interested in and say, oh, wow, that's amazing. New York Times says 81% of people want to write a book. We know that less than 1% of people actually do it. So a lot of people in the lead up, they'll see you doing it. They're excited about that. And so when you say, hey, I'm looking for people to join my launch team, they'll be interested because they've seen the behind the scenes leading up to you publishing your book.
That's super cool. And so you're talking about the leading up to and on day 1 having a bunch of reviews, and you said 100, which is, I guess that does something with the Amazon algorithm that helps your book be higher up in the rankings and things. I'm wondering though, you said launch year. What do you do after that? What is the process that someone goes through after the big launch, after you've got 100 Amazon reviews, et cetera, et cetera? What do you do next for that next year?
Yeah. You keep talking about the book, and no, there's one-off promos, and then there's evergreen assets. My goal is to do as many one-off promos as possible as part of the launch and leading up to the launch and after the launch. But really the goal is to create evergreen assets. So an evergreen tree, has leaves that are green year round. Evergreen assets are things that you create that will continue to sell books in perpetuity, right? So an interview like this, evergreen asset that will help me sell more copies of my book published, all that stuff, right? And so this is an asset that will continue to add value to listeners, that will continue to sell books, like all those things. And so I try to think about, as an author, how can I spend that year creating as many of those assets as possible, so that the book continues to sell and continues to grow.
I love the fact that you've codified this process so well. This is phenomenal. Talk to me a little bit about that, if you would, because here's the thing, right? We in the late 90s, early aughts, we had the independent music revolution, right? Things changed when people could start putting out their own MP3s, et cetera, et cetera. They weren't beholden to gatekeepers anymore. And the same thing has happened with publishing, that we're not beholden to the big 6 or big 5 now to release a book. If you want to release a book, you can do it yourself. It's different. It's, the book publishing revolution is different because I think the publishing houses are still holding on. There's still this weird gatekeeper thing. Can you talk a little bit about the push-pull of that between traditional publishing and something like what you're doing with Self-Publishing School and what that means for an author who goes one way versus another.
Definitely. I think it's I think it's the self-publishing revolution. And I think we've tried to help it. We've tried to put the power back in the hands of authors and help as many folks publish as possible and self-publish. And now traditional publishing has its merits in some instances. If you've got a big audience and you can get a big advance and all those things, then sometimes it makes sense to traditionally publish. Otherwise, you're going to be better off self-publishing, right? And so that's what we've tried to do is put the power back in the hands of authors and help them self-publish. And you're right, because this kind of the beautiful thing for authors is that self-publishing, and my brother's in the music industry, so I've seen firsthand that shift as well for music. It's very similar. Is that it's democratized the industry. And it's much more merit-based, which I think is a beautiful thing. I think there's a beautiful thing about entrepreneurship, but then now it's becoming the beautiful thing about authorship as well, is that the best book wins. Now, the best book that nobody knows about doesn't win. Like, you still got to market that book, because you could have the best book ever, and if no one knows about it, it's not going to start getting traction or grow. So marketing is very important, but so is writing a great book. And there's a whole lot less gatekeepers that can keep you from writing or publishing that book.
I love that. And again, mic drop. Chandler, one of the things that I would love for you to do, because I know people learn differently, if you don't mind, is how do people find you? If somebody wants to know more about Self-Publishing School or wants to follow you and some of the wisdom you drop, like on social media, would you mind giving me sort of, verbally right now, your website and your socials, just so that people can find you if they're looking?
Yeah, of course. So social, I'm only on Facebook. We have Self-Publishing School, like Instagram and all that stuff. That people on the team who are really good at that do that. I'm not so great at that. I'm personally on Facebook. Our site is self-publishingschool.com. We also own selfpublishing.com. So either of those resources will lead you to our stuff. If you're interested in chatting with the team about your book and how we might be able to help, you can go to self-publishingschool.com/apply. You can book a call with the team there. We'll chat with you, help create a plan for your book, and see how we might be able to help. And then lastly, if you're, audio learner, if you're listening to this, probably check out the audio book of my new book published, or you can take me up on that, the free book thing, and claim a free copy of the book and read the good old fashioned print version of the book. And the book, it will really expand on a lot of what we've talked about in this episode and help more on your journeys. There's a bunch of templates and stuff like that.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. And I want a copy of the book too. What I'm most like, how do I put this? There are concierge services, and I don't know if Self-Publishing School offers this. If somebody says, I have an idea, I've written a book, but I don't want to do any of it, do you offer that service?
Yeah, we help a lot.
Okay.
Now, important disclaimer, I'd say, so we do, we'll create a best-selling book cover for you. We'll format the book. We'll upload it to Amazon. We'll do keywords and like a bunch of the tough technical stuff. But there's no substitute. Like, those authors still need to market their books. All right. Now, we're going to make marketing easier. We're going to coach you on how to do it. We're going to hold you accountable. We're going to give you frameworks to use, like all those things. But I think it's one of the most important jobs that an author has. And often authors will come to us and say, okay, cool. Can I just pay you guys to market the book? And the answer is no, unfortunately. And fortunately, because it's one of the single most powerful things you can do as an author, and that you need to do as an author. And no one can market the book like you can.
Absolutely. And as an author, no one knows your story like you know your story, whether or not it's a nonfiction book and you have pain that you're trying to alleviate, or it's a fiction book and it's a story that you're super excited to tell. No one's going to be able to talk about it the way you can if you're the one who wrote it. So absolutely, I agree completely. Well, Chandler, I want to thank you so much for being on the show, for taking the time. And I also have one last question, if that's okay, before we move on to the bonus round, which is always super fun. So the question is a silly question, but I find that it can yield some profound answers, and I ask it of every single person who comes on the show. And the question is this: if you had an airplane, environmentally friendly, of course, that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
just get started.
I love it.
Whether it's your book, whether it's this goal that you have, a business that you want to start, whatever, just get started. You're never going to be ready. Just start, get feedback, and then improve. That'd be it. Just get started.
I love it. I love it. Chandler, thank you once again for being on the show. This is Chandler Bolt with the Self-Publishing School. I'm super grateful. And if you want to take take advantage of getting a physical copy of the book, what's the URL again, one last time?
Yeah. So it's published book. So like I published a book. So publishedbook.com/Izolda, IZOLDA.
Awesome. And I'll put all the links to all of that stuff in the show notes. Chandler, once again, thank you. We're going to be back in just a second with that super fun little bonus episode. But until next time, this is Izolda Trachtenberg for the Innovative Mindset Podcast, reminding you to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Izolda Trachtenberg and is copyright 2022. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, remember to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind.